Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth session of the fall 2023 season of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be talking about a new book by Alan Bollard entitled Economists in the Cold War, How a Handful of Economists Fought the Battle of Ideas, published by Oxford University Press on September 30th. And with us today is a panel consisting of Ariane Dupont-Kiefer, Catherine Lavelle, and Jay Bradford DeLong. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, who can't be with us today. The seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association, and we've been in business exploring new historical scholarship since 2010. A couple of FYIs before we get going. First, the seminar will not be taking place this coming Monday, which is a federal holiday, but rather a week from Thursday on October 12th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we reconvene to discuss Samuel Friedman's new book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. Second, as always, I'd like to recognize two people who work very hard behind the scenes to pull these seminars off, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. On the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded. It can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function. That way, I get to call on you, you unmute, you get to pose the question directly, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, in which case you type out a question and I get to read it. And we'll call on as many folks as we can. Okay. We got those preliminaries out of the way. I'd like to get the seminar fully underway. Alan Bollard is an economics professor at Victoria University of Wellington. He has a diverse background. He formerly managed APEC, the world's largest regional trade organization. He was governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and he was secretary of the New Zealand Treasury. He has written an insider account of the global financial crisis called Crisis, published in 2010 with Auckland University Press. He wrote a biography of the economist Bill Phillips, A Few Hares to Chase, published by Oxford in 2016, a study of World War II economics and economists at war, how a handful of economists helped win and lose the world wars, published by Oxford in 2020. He joins us today for the first time. Alan, welcome to the seminar. We look forward to hearing about your new book.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, Rachel Wheatley, and thanks to the Washington History Seminar. I'm very pleased to be here today. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book on World War II, as Eric just said, and it was about the role that economists were playing, which was a new role for many of them, and quite an active role. In general, they were doing a lot more work on financing, on supply management and planning, on stabilization of a civilian versus a military economy, some quite new challenges for them. And that lasted through the war through to 1945, basically. And then things changed. The Cold War changed a lot of this. And I've been interested to look at just how that did change issues for economists, how they responded to that, and how they contributed to that early Cold War period. And my book covers the period 1945 through about 1972, starts really with the Potsdam Conference, but it's a very new environment that economists are operating in. There's demobilization going on. There's obviously a lot of physical reconstruction, but even more than that, there's a lot of reconstruction of systems, moving, at least in some cases, to a more consumerized sort of economy. And underpinning that, there's a lot of socioeconomic fundamental changes going on. Of course, we know all about the decoupling into the Western Bloc led by the United States, the Eastern Bloc, Soviet Union. And compared to the talk about decoupling today, this was real decoupling, very little trade or other economic interplay between those blocs. They had their own rules of operation, broadly Bretton Woods plus on one side and Comecon on the other side. It was a period of polarization, or maybe I should say bipolarization, Marxism versus capitalism, labor versus capital, surplus value versus profits. central planning versus markets, and communism versus democracy. And right in the middle of that, you had economists who themselves tended to get labelled or pushed, or sometimes very willingly labelled themselves as one of those two polar positions. If you look for economic advancement through this period, I'd say there's a lot of interesting work done on microeconomic as opposed to macroeconomics, so optimization, dynamic programming, modeling, gaming, computing. And in the US, that's done in a number of institutions. The CIA sets the lead in terms of laying out resources and getting very serious economics and economists involved in looking particularly at the Eastern Bloc economies, but also partly at the US. And that's carried through by a number of think tanks. And of course, RAND Institution is the leading name in that. And it's a great time for universities, a lot of funding, especially if you're interested in the military-industrial complex. On the Soviet side, it's a bit different. There are, of course, state universities. There's academies of scientists. There's science cities. There's a lot of direction and a lot of prohibition also about how you can operate and how you should be doing that. And of course, on both sides, there's intelligence that's coming out in a covert way and getting across that bipolar divide. Most of these economists have been through depression, they've been through war, and they're now experiencing some form of intellectual repression, be it the more gentle sort of being a socialist in an American university through this period was not easy. Being a capitalist in a Soviet institution was simply not possible and extremely dangerous. And so there's political labeling going on, and most economists find some way of conforming or operating in those systems. My book is perhaps a bit of an unusual look at this because I do it through the eyes of 7 selected international economists who played a role in Cold War thinking. They're academics, they're policy people, they're politicians. They used economics in arguments, in some of the important arguments of the Cold War. And I pose them in each chapter against a rival, a protagonist who takes a different view, and you see these economic debates going on. It is quite a biased selection. I've picked interesting people who can carry through these stories. My book doesn't represent a set of biographies. I'm only looking at some aspects of these players. And in addition, I would say it's not a full history of the Cold War period either. These are very particular views looking through. So, for example, I start off telling a story of Harry Dexter White, well-known Assistant Secretary of US Treasury, and his arguments at Bretton Woods around the international rules of the game, with particularly Keynes. The story has been well known and well told. I put a particular lens on it. These two economists have different views of what international leadership should look like. And in the case of Harry Dexter White, he's clearly interested in US leadership, but he has this very interesting thing going on that he also wants to ensure that the Soviet Union plays their role in this leading economic period as well. And of course, we need to remember the Soviet Union had effectively won the European war. It wasn't the Americans, it wasn't the British, it wasn't the New Zealanders. It was a huge military exercise from the Soviets. I moved to Oskar Lange, the well-known Polish economist who came to US universities and showed US academics his views about the economics of socialism in a way that they could really relate to them. And he engaged in a long debate with history school. I put up Hayek against him on the question of can planned economies ever be efficient, what's known as the economic calculation debate. I moved to John von Neumann, a brilliant Hungarian-American physicist, mathematician. He's on the sidelines in the whole Oppenheimer stuff. And he only wrote a couple of papers of economic relevance, but they're world-leading, world-changing papers. Of course, one was the book he wrote with Morgenstern on economic games, and the other was a very obscure mathematical paper he wrote back in the 1920s, which really, when it was translated and explained to economists, because it was obscure, led to what we know now as the expanding economy model. Does expanding economies rely on capital or labor? A big, interesting way of putting the capitalist argument in equal terms. And in my case, I put him up against a Russian economist called Leonid Kantorovich, who was also a brilliant mathematician, and interestingly was working on the Soviet enormous nuclear project at exactly the same time as von Neumann is in Los Alamos, and he actually gets information from Klaus Fuchs, who's working with von Neumann in his laboratory. Kantorovich gets the Nobel Prize. Ultimately, he discovers linear programming. He extends it to the possibility of optimization mathematically for a whole economy. He is all the time fighting against and sometimes running away from that very strong Soviet ideologue view. You can't talk about models in this way. They've got shadow prices in there. That's denying the role that Marx gave to the value of labor. I move on to Ludwig Erhard, the German politician. He sort of just became a politician by chance. He was guided by the Ordo Economists, University of Freiburg, on social market economics, which to him was not libertarian. It was freeing up markets from regulatory control, but with a strong underpinning social safety net. And he saw those as a sort of middle way, workable compromise. And certainly this underpinned some of the German economic miracle. He's arguing in this chapter with John Monnet, who of course was the architect of what's now the European Union. And his approach was a common market framework, relying on both economies of scale, but also with a very strong underpinning geopolitical aim to ensure that France and Germany would never go to war again, as it happened twice in the last century. Just quickly on to Joan Robinson, Cambridge academic, an economist with sympathies for Marxism, not a Marxist herself, and certainly sympathies for socialism, arguing for 35 years with Paul Samuelson, and particularly around what became known as the Cambridge controversy. And in this chapter, we talk about their arguments about, is investment driven by income distribution or by profitability? I then take a step to Asia. Saburo Okita is a Japanese economist who has, like many of them, a very tough time during the war, immediately after the war. He gets a bunch of economists together and they start planning out ways in which the Japanese economy can recover and grow, and ultimately leading to this East Asian model, or the flying geese model, as it's sometimes called, which really changes the economies and the life of East Asians from Japan and then through the Eastern ties, through the ASEANs, and now in China today. I put him against the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai at a particular dinner in Beijing in 1970. They had a long argument about what is the purpose of economic growth. To Okita, it was to improve living standards for your citizens. For Zhou Enlai, it was something much more worrying. It was about building up forces, in his case for security, but what he was worrying about with Japanese economic growth was dangers of invasion again. My last chapter goes to the Southern Hemisphere and profiles the Argentinian economist who worked for a long time in Chile, Raul Prebisch, known for the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis that, roughly speaking, says that developing countries with commodity exports are unfairly punished by industrial market terms of trade. And he set up and ran one of the United Nations regional economic agencies in Santiago and built a big and important cohort of Southern economists in doing that. And then later was Secretary General of UNCTAD. And in these roles ran up against a lot of American opposition, particularly during that time when they were really worried about communist influences into Latin America, and particularly his arguments with Walt Rostow, well-known economic historian. At this stage, he's a presidential advisor. They have some very angry exchanges together. And Rostow, of course, has written his book called Stages of Growth, Anti-Communist Manifesto. And if you're a South American economy with low income levels, it's basically your own fault for poor design of policies, because out there you have a 5-stage series of growth where you can run through with a good set of policies to guide you in. Start at the Potsdam Conference. I end up in 1972 in the last chapter in Santiago. And of course, what's happening there is that Salvador Allende has come into power as a socialist president. He has heard of the writings of Oscar Lange, and Lange, just before he dies, just a couple of years previous, has gone back to his arguments about economic calculation and how a planned economy can be efficient, because he's now read about modern computers, computer architecture from von Neumann, computer development in the United States. And he's saying, what's the problem? You just put a whole economy onto a computer and get it to estimate the requirements and with basically an equation for every product that you're producing, which factors in demand and equilibrates, optimizes supply. Allende gets hold of a slightly obscure British consultant called Stafford Beer, brings him out to Chile and gets him to work to build a computerized model of the economy to run the Chilean economy on. And he builds this thing called Cybersyn, which consists of, in Santiago, an operational control center, circular room with a whole bunch of rotating chairs on it. And the chairs have all got joysticks on them. They don't have keyboards on them because these are to be run by blue-collar workers, and their fingers are too big for keyboards. And they are going to plot out decisions on the Chilean economy, and they're doing it because Allende has corporatized or nationalized something like several hundred Chilean big businesses, the state-owned enterprises now. Thank you, and Brad's just putting up a background for this at the moment. And the picture the information they get comes on a set of telex machines, which ironically are linked out into all the state-owned enterprises and then back into this control center by the wires of ITT, the American company, which with the assistance of the CIA is playing a background role in undermining the socialist economy. Every day, basically what's happening is they're following the Lange principle of saying you don't just need markets to pick up on the Austrian idea of prices controlling all the information and leading and giving you signals back about whether you should produce more or less for any particular market. You can do it by what he called the Walrasian auctioneer, a supply side process where every day, every state-owned enterprise would telex into the control center in Santiago for a product they're producing, information about how much they're producing, and control center would send back saying whether there's a glut or a surplus, and production would be reassigned in that particular way. Would it work? Well, we're guessing not for a large and sophisticated civilian economy with a lot of consumer products there. But we never really got the chance to see, because a couple of months later, there was a coup engineered by General Pinochet. It's 50 years exactly since that happened. Allende died. The Pinochet soldiers went into that control room, put bayonets on their rifles, and went through and rather ritualistically stabbed all the monitors on the wall in a sort of interesting, almost metaphysical denial of socialist economy by capitalists. And of course, Pinochet took over and put in place a cabinet and a central bank that was broadly led by what we know as the Chicago Boys, who had been trained at the University of Chicago by Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation scholarships in programs led by Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger. And later, Friedman went out to advise Pinochet. He was criticized very much for doing that, and he said that all he was doing was giving advice in the way that a doctor would give advice against an evil virus, and he should not be criticized for that. That's the end of my book. I stop at 1973. There's a lot of empty questions there, and I hope I'll hear some of them back from my commentators today. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Alan. Our first discussant this afternoon is Ariane Dupont-Kiefer of the Sorbonne School of Economics at the Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. She focuses her research on the links between economic theory, modeling and policymaking, and policy assessment. She's done extensive research in the area of epistemology and history of economic thought, and focuses specifically on the history of econometrics and macroeconomics and the relationship between measurement issues, statistical analysis, and policymaking. After 10 years of experience of investigating theoretical and methodological issues, she worked with the French Institute of Science and Technology for Transport, Development, and Networks. And within this perspective of sustainable transportation, she's developed an understanding of the determinants of mobility with a focus on gender and equity issues to be related to efficiency. And an important part of her work is dedicated to enhance international comparisons of data on gender and equity in mobility and to translate research findings into policy implementation. I should also note she served as Dean of the Sorbonne School of Economics, where she is now Vice President for Social Responsibility and Sustainability. Ariane, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you for the invitation by the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center to present my understanding of Alan's book. I already wrote, I have written a review on his previous book, so I was very impatient to read the story after the war. So it's a very interesting book at the crossroad between different histories. And it's not a book on history of economic thought, but a book based on using history of economics, history of politics, history of geopolitics, a biographical path, as in the previous book. And it's really interesting because Alan is always crossing and merging this kind of history. So you have to love history, but all kinds of histories in order to appreciate the book. My first question will be on the structure of the book. Before I will have a sandwich approach, question and a statement. The first question is the biographical path was very interesting in the first book, and you cross at the end all these histories and this path, and in this book you do the same. But I think that in a way the Cold War is too complex in order to have this kind of approach, because there are too many actors. And even if you use the controversy approach in order to try to design or to a kind of different landscape between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, or even after the North and South Bloc, it's difficult to reduce the history of this period to biographies or to key person. And my question is, how did you first question, how did you pick up this person? We don't understand the criteria of your selection. For example, as we end with the Chicago Boys, why Friedman is not in the history? Because Milton Friedman, and he traveled to France and changed his mind after he stayed in France. He changed also his methodology after the Second World War. So it was puzzling not to have him in the history. But the positive aspect of this biographical approach is that we can see different threads between the communities, and we can see how people circulate in between the international organization, the national institution, the university, and different academic sphere. And it helps us to understand it was not only a bipolar world. It was more complex than that. And thanks to your different approach of your 7 character, we see that they are moving and meeting and exchanging ideas. So we can see in your book how far people are moving and ideas are moving. And the approach of the controversies helps to understand this kind of communities. What I like is the idea of spy. Why? At the beginning, I was puzzled by the spy approach, but it concludes, in fact, our conference we had in Duke this late spring, is that if you have a spy, it's because it's worth to spy. And the idea was not here. What you explained very clearly is not only to spy because you want to understand how the other countries want to become a super economic power, but it's more spying also about ideas. So it means that economics or economic framework as a gathering of theories, methodology, and so on, is worth to understand because it's a way to understand the world and to shape the world. And we understand by the last chapter how it matters to have the dominant ideas, the dominant framework over the world. And it's really a fight of ideas and different view of what is economics. But what you should maybe go and to dig is, for example, between Robinson and Samuelson. What is at stake is not only ideas, it's also different view to understand the world. Econometrics versus Keynesian approach. And not in terms of theory, but in terms of using equation, using data. And maybe the end of your story is not only the Pinochet coup, but it's also the Lucas critique. Lucas critique who has decided that econometric modeling approach used to set up planning and was not working anymore. So the end of your story is not only politics, it's also epistemology. So the second question is, in this complex stand, I don't understand why you are not digging in the no man's land or the no time land between 1944 and 1947 or 48. That time lag between the end or almost the end of the war and the beginning of these two institutions fighting against each other, especially Plan Marshall versus Plan Molotov, Comecon versus Plan Marshall and the Western Bloc. Because at the different international organizations, for example, the United Nations, the Commission for Employment, for example, or Economic Stability, the Commission for Trade, you have all your actors at the same table. You have Jean Monnet, Kalecki, Oscar Lange, the two missing people are Ragnar Frisch and Jan Tiberken. They are talking about building up a multilateral world. And they talking about ideas how to implement this world. And I think that you should have dig into the work at the United Nations and show how far these actors try also to develop what was done during the League of Nations. And there is not only a disruption by the World War, but there is a continuity between what was done at the League of Nations and the beginning of the United Nations. So I didn't understand why you didn't investigate so far what was done at the United Nations. That's my second question. What is interesting in your book, again, is to focus on different aspects and to raise the question. Is you insist on what are key industries and for planning and for nationalization and so on. But which are these key industries? You are talking about coal, especially for Japan, it's very clear, it's coal, steel, energy, and so on. But in many countries, this key sector were under a planning and centralized planning before the war. In France, railway energy started to be planned and organized as a monopoly before the war. So, and how the war changed the economics of this sector, what I call the network sector, which has a different approach. So why not specifying which are the key sectors? I would like to underline that in the chapter on Japan, you put the focus on training the population in order to improve the skill of the labor force, which was at stake in every country. And maybe my last question is why you didn't, why do you know, you are not offering a more, I was to say, more complex view of, because in the Eastern Bloc, for example, you cannot say that there is only the Soviet approach or Oscar Lang and so on. You have Tito. Tito developed another approach, a cooperative approach, and tried to spread in the world. The third world, the South, you have very big, huge difference between the economy who were colonies like India and those who were not colonies like South Latin America. And for example, Prebisch cannot develop the same kind of theoretical thinking as Samir Amin in Egypt or Mala Anobis in India, who were trained by the center. They're at the periphery, but they have to develop another framework. But they are still very close to the initial framework, which is not the case of Prebisch. So it would have been nice to offer a less black and white story on that. And last question, why did not you mention Ragnar Frisch or Jan Timbergen? Especially Frisch, because he was in Norway and Norway was squeezed between USSR and the Western world. Thank you so much for your book, and I'm very happy to discuss your book.
Thank you, Ariane. Alan, any thoughts to respond?
Oh, yeah, thanks very much, Ariane. I knew I could rely on you for a very thorough and thoughtful analysis of that, and you bring up some good points. Just picking up on some of them, the Cold War was much more complex in some ways than World War II. And as you say, there's all kinds of histories in there. The paths of these people don't cross in the same way as I was able to argue in the World War II book. This is decoupling of intellectuals and intellectual thought, as well as decoupling of economies. And of course, the particularly Soviet-US interconnections were very, very infrequent, and very much, there was a very strong sort of air of suspicion on them all. There's some lovely work and writing by Koopmans as he goes to the Soviet Union, gets onto the work of Kantorovich and tries to connect that up with some of the work going on in the US at the time. Kantorovich, of course, had invented linear programming effectively in the early 40s, and the Americans reinvented it with Dissent and others with the simplex method later on. So there were these examples of things being invented and reinvented. A different example, though, would be von Neumann with his computer architecture, then quite surprisingly writing it all up and putting it out in open access, and the Russians poring over that in terms of working out their own computer architecture on a lot of that. As you can't really reduce the Cold War story to keep people in quite the same way. There are a lot more people, a lot more economics, a lot more institutions, a lot more policy discussions. But I have tried to focus in and put the spotlight on some of these policy discussions. Friedman, I really ruled Friedman out of primary discussion because he's talking in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I'm cutting off. So my arguments are mainly in the late 40s, 50s, and a little bit of the 60s. And so some people just don't get into that period. And even then, I'm talking about over 2 decades, so it's quite a long time. And I didn't think I could really usefully talk about the later years of the Cold War. Spies, yeah, fascinating. I mean, there's a sort of a view you're either a spy or you're not a spy. But of course, this book and that period are full of people who had mixed incentives, mixed sympathies, and mixed opportunities. And Harry Dexter White is one of many in that respect, in that they, in many cases, had been through the Depression in the US and saw an interesting, different economic model in the Soviet Union, and then saw the Soviet Union quite effectively translate that into military strengths during World War II. And that meant that in the New Deal agencies, there were a large number of Soviet sympathizing American administrators, and some of them were spies. I hesitate to label Dexter White with that particular label. I think it's a difficult one to do, but it's also interesting then how they have to operate, even in the States, in this very difficult, hostile environment of McCarthyism and what that does to reputations. But in the case of Harry Dexter White, it gave him a heart attack, and he died after a hearing. So it does put us into a different sort of period. Just picking up briefly on a couple of the other things you said, United Nations agencies. Well, no, that's an interesting point. Thank you. I could have put more emphasis on the central United Nations agencies. I try and cover some of that off with the Latin American story and the ECLAT in Santiago and what Prebisch is doing in that particular case. Key industries, well, I mean, coal and steel are everything during World War II, but they're not everything after World War II. And of course, during the Cold War, we're seeing, first of all, nuclear technologies changing the economies, and nuclear technologies don't require the same spending, and they certainly don't require spending on all the troops that World War II required. And that leads to quite different economic decisions. In addition, you're seeing economies in one way or the other getting much more focused on consumers and consumer products. And many of those, of course, big coal and steel and energy in them. But with international trade, some of that coal and steel is going to be in offshore countries anyway. So it is a different sort of changing place in a lot of that. I take your points about Malinowitz and Tinbergen. Couldn't do everything in there, Ariane. What was my selection criteria? Well, there was an underpinning one, which is how illuminating are some of these debates that were going on. And by throwing a spotlight on some of these ones, you get some different pictures of what's going on in the Cold War. Thanks for your comments. It's given me some things to think about.
Thank you. Our second discussant this afternoon is Catherine Lavelle, who is currently the Ellen and Dixon Long Professor of World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. Her research explores the exchange between domestic and international and political institutions, with a particular emphasis on political economy and multilateralism. Her first book, The Politics of Equity Finance in Emerging Markets, explored the political circumstances that surround large issues of stock in the developing world. She later drafted the manuscript for the book Legislating International Organization, the U.S. Congress, the IMF, and the World Bank during the 2008-9 academic year, while a resident fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Her next project is a book tentatively titled American Foreign Relations in the Arctic, Science, National Security, and the Economics. She's a permanent member of the New York Council on Foreign Relations. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the welcome. Thanks. It's great to see everyone at the Wilson Center always, even if it's virtually. And I'm very happy to meet the other panelists too. I was very honored to receive the invitation from the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center. So I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed the exchange so far, and I also want to congratulate Dr. Bollard particularly for adding this really important dimension to our knowledge of the Cold War and the politics of economics and international relations during these years. I really enjoyed reading the book. And as I've said, I look forward to learning more about it in our discussion. So as we've already said, for those listening in who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, it follows the lives of 7 economists and details their work in the government of the time, both in the East and the Western blocks, and then it moves to the developing world. I really like this approach. I found that it echoed, again, for people who are familiar with Heilbronner's worldly philosophers. I like that approach because, like Heilbronner, you did such a great job connecting the life and times of the economists to the rise of capitalism and market allocation, as opposed to kind of a more authoritative allocation, both in Europe and the United States. But Heilbronner leaves off where economics becomes a social science, and economists are trying to be more scientific in their more objective, and they're seeking a way to be able to predict more with mathematics. So I really like the fact that you picked the story up there, because I like that approach, and I was really happy to read more about it in that way. So what I like about it is that when the author focuses on an individual person, the reader, at least myself or someone else, gets a handle on the person. But then, as you've all pointed out, the contrasting economist, but in the case of this book too, how the ideas grew out of the context of the individuals who were all being contrasted. So this was very well done, I thought. Not only for the interwar years, because you trace their lives through the interwar years all the way through the Cold War and into the future, like you did with Okita and Prevish. So where I found the book also to be particularly strong was in the links that it drew between the Cold War and these major events. So we could see the connection among these different aspects to the continuation of the story of capitalist development. So it's really a tour de force if you haven't had a chance to read it, both for the period as well as for the lives of these individuals. I was just fascinated reading about them. And I really recommend it to anyone who's interested in this topic and hasn't had a chance to read it yet. So with that said, I'll follow the lead and pose 3 questions. I have 3 main areas that I'd be interested just in hearing more from you about. And most of them relate along the lines of our other discussant about how you went about selecting the individuals. And also, now that you're done writing it and you've had a chance to step back, how do you reflect on these individuals now that you've completed the book, which is always a happy feeling, but then also sometimes hard to let go. And so the first question I have with respect to the selection of the individuals, you can tell I'm an American, and I went to American schools. So we tend to get fed this Cold War as an economic and a military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. What I really liked as I read further and further into your book is both the connections, but also the lack of connections between the actual adversaries and the power of economic ideas. So what I mean by that is in writing about the economists, as you did, you chose some that were American, but then as the book wears on, not so many. And the ones who were American, so White, von Neumann, Samuelson, you talked about their first generation, the experiences of being a first generation immigrant in the United States and the connections that they had to this contested territory in the Cold War. So I really gained a lot from this. I really liked it because it forced me to question, how much of these ideas were really between the principal adversaries and how much was this going on in the broader world of economics and distance from it. So the way you presented it, not exclusively, and in fact, I don't know how far you would go in terms of the American-Soviet aspect of it. And maybe here you could talk a little bit more about the Soviet side. I'm interested in that. And so just take us through your thinking in conceptualizing this contest of ideas and kind of what their connection is to the actual to the main combatants, if you want to think of it that way. Like I say, I'm not sure I'm thinking of it that way. Anyway, the second question, very much you've really covered a lot of this, so I don't know how much more you want to say, because like the previous discussant, I also was curious about some of the people who weren't included. I think Jan Tinbergen did come to mind for me as well because of his connection to the League, the League of Nations. I thought John Conliffe, and I'm not just saying it because he's from New Zealand, but again, he's one of these people who crosses over and had the connection. As I recall, my history of the economic section of the League of Nations, he was one of the early skeptics of the Austrian school and then moved to Berkeley and really transcended so many of these debates that you're talking about. I also thought of Friedman and I just threw Karl Polanyi in there, but I guess you've already really talked about that. I'm curious if there was anyone that if you could have written another chapter or unfortunately, like you say, I mean, the book, you did such it's a great range, but then we all have to make cuts. So if there was anyone that you would have added. And just the third kind of area besides kind of the American Soviet angle and the people left out, but the third angle would just be, in my field, I'm trained as a political scientist. And so a lot of political scientists have written widely on the political power of economic ideas, as I'm sure you're aware. And in political science, we tend to emphasize the role that institutions play in these. So, a lot of the work has been done on Keynes. And I like the fact that you didn't spend some of the books get overwhelmed with Keynes. But in examining the spread of Keynesian ideas, the existing literature tends to make a really big deal about the different role of the American Treasury and the British Treasury. Just for example, that made it easier, ironically, to accept Keynesian ideas earlier, and then perhaps later in the UK, even though everyone arrived by the 1960s in both countries at the same point. But I guess what I'm asking you is, at the end of your book, it seems as you've also pointed out, many of these individuals seem broken, seem sad. It reminded me, I was an econ major as an undergrad, and we were still calling it the dismal science. But I wondered if really what you're saying here is the bigger part of the story isn't only the contest of ideas, but also the battle of these domestic political institutions as well, and how even with powerful ideas, it can be really difficult or easy to affect change. So I'd be interested in hearing your thinking on any of that. But like I said, it's just been a really terrific opportunity to read this. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Catherine. Alan?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Catherine. Some slightly different sort of interesting angles on all of that. Just responding to you, how were the individuals selected? I mean, that's, very good question. And I was interested in these debates on ideas. I was interested in how they brought ideas forward. I was focused in on very Cold War sort of issues, and I certainly didn't get into some domestic issues, which are important because they're underpinning in a lot of that. And just going to the point you made right at the end, domestic institutions as well. No, there are absolutely, there's stuff going on, for example, in Britain and in France, in that period, which is very fundamental and very important. In Britain, you've got the government coming in, a bit surprisingly, on the vote of soldiers who kicked Winston Churchill out, and coming in with a very active program of nationalisation or corporatisation and big social expenditures, big housing expenditures, and so on. And that's really dominating the British story for the next 10, 20 years. So in one sense, they become much more domestically focused. The economic contributions are around that domestic area. And people like Joan Robinson and Kaldor and others who are in this Cold War story absolutely are playing an important domestic role in all of that as well. So that's an important underpinning, but missing a little bit from some of the debates that are going on, which are these sort of classically Cold War, one system versus another system sort of arguments. In my selection of economists, I sort of pushed back a little bit about a couple of obvious people. And one of them, obviously, is John Maynard Keynes. And I suppose, going back to Ariane's point, Milton Friedman is another, but he's a little bit later on. And of course, they're there, and their influence is there and underpinning a whole bunch of things. But in a sense, I didn't want them to overpower some of these important arguments going on underneath that as well. Connections between these adversaries, they're a complete mixture. I get a feeling that Prebisch and Rostow are pretty near fisticuffs in Rostow's office in Washington. On the other hand, Kantorowicz and von Neumann never meet and never could meet. Actually, that's not entirely true. They're both at a seminar before the war, but they don't know one another at that stage. Ones like Robinson and Samuelson have got this voluminous correspondence, and then some really interesting comments from Samuelson when he actually meets Robinson in her rooms in Cambridge, and she's wearing orange pajamas and drinking whiskey and playing poker and arguing about factor price equalization all at the same time. And he's sort of he's pretty impressed by a lot of this. It's not there in his upbringing. But then as their relationship goes on, he's also making asides to Solo about why can't she get it, what I'm saying? Why does she keep coming back at me like this all the time? And they several times, from both ends, say, we're not getting anywhere, you're not listening to me, and this is the end of this correspondence. But it isn't, it goes on. First generation immigrants, yes, so interesting, particularly in Britain, but especially in the United States. And I'd love to see some in-depth studies of a lot of that. So many economists and others, of course, coming out of Nazi Germany and Austria and just before the war, Jewish particularly, but not just. And then at the beginning of the Cold War, relying on so many immigrants whose parents may have fled, pogroms in the old Tsarist Russia in the 1890s through 1910s, or more recently in the 1930s. And what an abundance of knowledge and talent came out of those areas, particularly into the US. And the US, there was something about US academia that made very good use of much of this. So those people had gone through either themselves through huge problems and disruptions themselves, or they knew their parents had, in the case of, say, Harry Dexter White. And they're coming in often with Russian language, Bergson, Leontiev, and others, and they play a significant role in interpreting what's going on in the Soviet economy and how to deal with it. And then you get ones like von Neumann, who are just rabid anti-communist. He's seen what's happened in Hungary with Bela Kun and very strongly against it. He says to Congress, when they're going through their hearings for the Atomic Energy Agency membership, he's saying, we've got the bomb, they haven't got the bomb, they're going to get the bomb in a couple of years, what are we waiting for? So that's mutually assured destruction.
Right. And I would quickly add to that the Nazi connection as well, because I seem to recall in the archives coming across references to Gottfried Haberler trying to get his cousins and relatives in. American immigration in that case was turning them down and trying to make excuses for why they were either members of the Nazi party or whatever. But I think it ran on both sides after the war. But yeah, no, I think it's really interesting what you're saying.
Yes, well, I'm no expert on that, and I'd love to read more from people who are experts on it. The US managed to do, of course, they did it in physics and nuclear technologies as well after the war, but they seem to be much better at absorbing these people and offering them opportunities. League of Nations, I'm reading about League of Nations at the minute. It is pretty interesting what went on there. Cunliffe and Tinbergen was sort of after the first few years, but the early role was played by, I think, really a British economist, well, administrator really, called Arthur Salter, who opens up and makes the economics directorate of the League of Nations a pretty open and interesting place for economists to come into and give their views about this really complex period of the 1920s after World War One, and then tries to, in 1927 World Conference, to put really an environment out there when economists and administrators can sign up to a much freer trading environment around the world, somewhat like what Harry Exeter White manages to do with the Bretton Woods. And now they all agree that in 1927, but there is pretty much no follow-up by governments in terms of ratifying those things. And then we see the real isolationism and growth of tariffs during the Great Depression. So those sort of ideas go out the window. Keynesian ideas, yeah, sure, absolutely. They're going through the system in different ways, and it's true that I don't really focus in on those, but they're underpinning and very important. There is a lot I've left out. I think Tinbergen, perhaps of any of them, I might rather like to have gone through and been able to look at what he was doing, what role he was playing, and who he was doing it with. But there's still obviously a lot more out there. Thanks very much, Catherine, for those.
Yeah, and you made me want to go and look into von Neumann, and they were all in Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Study together. So you gave me some great ideas too. So thank you very much.
Well, start off with the movie Oppenheimer.
Good work if you can get it. Before we get to our third commentator this afternoon, let me just say that if there are those of you in the audience who wish to pose a question, now is the time to get in the queue using the raise hand function or the Q&A function. So no reason to wait if you've got something on your mind. And our third and final discussant this afternoon is Brad DeLong, a professor of economics at UC Berkeley, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a web blogger at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and a fellow of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Professor DeLong also served in the U.S. government as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy from 1993 to 95. He worked on the Clinton administration's 1993 budget, on the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, on the North American Free Trade Agreement, on macroeconomic policy, and on the unsuccessful healthcare reform effort. Before joining the Treasury Department, he was the Danziger Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at Harvard, and he has also been a John Olin Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, an Assistant Professor of Economics at Boston University, and a lecturer in the Department of Economics at MIT. Brad, welcome. The screen's yours.
Now, was it Robinson to Samuelson or Samuelson to Robinson who wrote, "I would not be so rude if you were not so pig-headed"? I forget which one of them was. Let's go back to Rostow and Prebisch, right? Rostow. In a thumbnail, any country that guarantees property rights and maintains full employment can develop as a democratic market capitalist society as long as it boosts its savings rate enough and invests at scale. Investment brings capital, capital brings engineers, Engineers bring technological advance and productivity, and you get the takeoff into self-sustained growth. So that's Rostow. Prebisch. In the thumbnail, supply of primary commodities is elastic while demand is inelastic. That means a developing country that accepts its place in the world capitalist division of labor cannot get self-sustained growth. Why not? Because the benefits from its technological advances all flow to the core, and none of the benefits remain in the periphery. Hence, developing countries cannot rely on the market to generate self-sustaining growth, but must subsidize land and social rights. That's Prebisch. Now, in the context of this debate, we also have the US's long turn away from economic development as a Cold War strategy to the pro-oligarch movement of anti-communism. A turn which I think reached its apogee in my high school friend Stuart's mother, Jean Kirkpatrick's art, Dictatorships and Double Standards, that brought her to the notice of the Reagan administration. Briefly, her argument was that the overthrow of Allende was justified because there was a road from Pinochet back to the rich and democratic Chile of today, while there was no road from Allende, rather from Allende's more hardline communist successors to the Chile of today. So that was the windup. Finally, the pit. To what extent do you see Rostow's energy in his debate with Prebisch as to some extent reflecting an argument within Rostow himself that his political and administrative commitments forced him to believe that his stages of economic growth was right, but that his analytical brilliance created a still small voice inside him whispering, maybe Prebisch has a point that he had found a very hard time dealing with. Indeed, I remember in one of his books, Rostow describes a trip to Indonesia when he was NSC chair to make the economic development pitch, and quotes Sukarno's reply to Kennedy, Mr. President, development takes food. Give me Irian Jaya instead.
We were out for about, I would say, 15 seconds.
So then I guess I was talking about maybe Rostow believed that Prebisch was right and a still small voice within inside himself.
Yes, it was about there, but if you can talk a bit closer to the microphone, it was quite hard to hear even some of what you were saying then.
Okay, all right. So then I'd say I guess that's my question. To what extent is the energy in Rostow's argument with Prebisch coming from an argument within Rostow himself and its attempts to squelch his own conscience doubting the policies to which he committed himself?
Yes, thanks for that. Well, I can't get inside Rostow's head in quite that way. I'm not sure I would want to either. This is a period when he's giving advice on Vietnam.
Yes.
Very strong advice, and he's sort of moved from being a good economic historian to being a pretty hardline advisor.
Yes. On the one hand, that was a day when the chairman of the National Security Council could be a development economist and an economic historian, rather than a specialist in bombs, bullets, and spies. On the other hand, the development economist and economic historian they chose was the most hawkish person imaginable when it did come to the bombs and bullets.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I get the feeling that he's being driven by his views about concern about communism spreading into Latin America, as well as a personal antipathy to Prebisch, who was capable of being pretty irritating and in your face in some of these discussions. The arguments particularly came when Prebisch was getting ready for UNCTAD 1 in Geneva. Rostow had really felt that he had failed to get his views heard by the Latin American UN agency, ECLA, and was worried now that they were spreading into the broader UNCTAD view. As someone, I think Ariane said, of course, there were many different views and good reason for many different views. Development economics wasn't just one thing. And what Prebisch was offering really was a sort of a shield for a lot of the problems and resentment that a number of economists in the third world had felt about the first world markets. And indeed, I might add, similar feelings from countries like New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, in terms of being commodity exporters into those markets as well. And so I do think that Rostow felt he had laid out the recipe for economic advancement, and it really a big failure on Latin Americans that they couldn't see, understand, and follow that as well. But did he have secret views about the role of non-aligned countries? I don't know. He was a very intelligent man. There's no sign of him showing those sympathies in his public statements around that time. Of course, he'd seen the growth of the non-aligned movement and the determined view of a number of third world countries to say they're not part of either the Soviet or the US blocs, sometimes erroneously, as in the case of China. Interestingly, I saw very recently those countries that refused to sign up to the United Nations resolution on sanctions against the Russian invasion of Ukraine look very like a list of the non-aligned movement that signed up originally in 1955 in Indonesia. But that's so the US is concerned and worried about whether there's going to be a lot of Soviet influence in the non-aligned movement, and there is some of it. I think he's got reason to be concerned about that. I just don't know whether he really thought that the infant industries arguments of Prebisch and the way those were sort of being used and misused in not just Latin countries but some other ones, whether he had a secret sympathy for that. I hadn't really thought about that.
And Rostow does seem to have had little recognition in the late 1950s and the 1960s that the then successful industrializers in Southern Europe and in Japan were indeed following a significantly different path than the British-American path that Rostow, the economic historian, done so much to map out and understand.
Unmute.
I thought that, in a way, what we know about Rostow, which in many cases is about his role as presidential advisor in time during the Vietnam War, rather underrates what he had achieved in his writings as an economic historian early on. And I guess what he tried to return to at the University of Texas after his role in Washington, when he found it very difficult to get any sort of academic appointment. But he was a very serious economic historian. Now, in his own mind, was he capable in his discussions with Prebisch of presenting that sort of economic historical view, or was he really presenting a political one? I got the feeling that politics had overtaken his mind at the time, just as they really label his contribution through that period. I think just picking up on that also, it is an example of how it's easy for us, looking back on the period, to think about these views from various angles. It was much harder at the time, not just because it was the time, but because of the pressures that were on you. So even in the reasonably liberal Western environment, there were strong pressures, overt and not so overt, on how people thought, how they talked to others, how they got on with their colleagues, and what they didn't say during the rougher times of the Cold War, by which I mean 1950s, 1960s. And it's a little bit easy for us to misjudge the constraints, which are ideological constraints, on them. Very clear for the Soviets. Kantorovich is pulled aside by commissars and told that he can't propose his ways of optimizing an economy because they've got shadow prices in them, and that's not Marxist. And he's told to pull back from that, and then he's advised by colleagues to go back to mathematics. It's less ideological, it's safer. And he, in contrast to von Neumann, is quite a quiet, retiring character, and he's very worried about all of this. And he does, and not surprising for someone who's been through what he had to go through in the war, and he does pull back into safer areas. And at times, other economists like Lange has to do that, definitely has to do it in the days after the war, the years after the war in Poland. And he's saying things about, for example, about Stalin's small book on economics in the Soviet Union. He's saying very laudatory, praising work on that, which from hindsight just looks ridiculous. And he's criticized by his American colleagues for doing that. But he's in a position where he really can't do much else. So we need to remember the constraints on these players.
Somewhat broader, but I remember Paul Freebie had similar things to say about Stalin's technical work on economics. It is very odd. I would have thought that Kantorovich would have had a very, very powerful protector in Alexei Kosygin, as someone trying to figure out the economic road forward to mass prosperity in the Soviet Union, especially since Kosygin made his reputation as the person who saved Soviet industry from the Nazis by moving it 1,000 miles east in 2 months in the fall of 1941. And, the supersession of Kosygin by Brezhnev and the tilt of Soviet policy away from domestic economic development to what one might characterize as third world adventurism has always been something that I have never understood.
Well, I guess the big change for people like Kantorovich is Khrushchev coming in the 50s. And you can see Kantorovich and his colleagues trying to work out what this means for them. And then some seminars which become increasingly, what's the word, they're a little freer in what they will talk about and how they will talk about. But then you also see some, the ideologues are still around, the commissars are still in position, and they close some of that down as well. Kosygin, yeah, but it's later on. That is a period when Kosygin is very interested in cybernetics and what that offers, and Soviets are very strong in cybernetics. So we do see a period when computer-based work grows, general economic mapping and planning becomes more scientific. Kantorovich does do work in that period. There's a whole bunch of other Soviet leading economists as well. And but then that goes through cycles where it gets closed down again when Kosygin goes too far on some of this. So it's a period of liberalization and then anti-liberalization. And there's a lot of scarring, ideological scarring around. So I don't think Kantorovich is ever in the period in his life when he really feels free to talk more broadly. And his Nobel Prize lecture is pretty interesting because by then he is talking and saying, I believe in the Soviet system. I believe in the ability to run efficient allocation of resources within that sort of system. And here's how I think you can do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad and Alan. I'm going to exercise my prerogative as co-chair of the seminar to ask a couple of questions of my own. And let me just say, I am not an economist or an economic historian. The last economics class I took was in the fall of 1976. And I remember on our assignment list was both Keynes' General Theory and some edition of Samuelson's textbook. But let's just say neither made a deep intellectual impression on me over the long term. So the outset in the prologue of the book, so I'm asking this as an historian and as someone who thinks about how arguments are constructed. You talk about the Cold War and its shaping of these debates and the ways in which the phrase that you use, it was not just a military Cold War, it was also a Cold War of ideas, one that was sometimes fought out in a brutal fashion. The framing of the book has to do with the binary between the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc, and that's the Cold War. But in the book itself, I'm wondering, you could have recast it in a different way, because at least in many of the examples, it was almost as if the economists in question, and I'm thinking about Harry Dexter White or Oscar Lange, they have battles within their own professions and their own governments. White invests his great hope in the 1948 election. You write in the Henry Wallace campaign, it doesn't go so well for him. And Lange is like up, he's down, he's down, he's up. His battles are internal, not just with opponents on the other side of the divide. So I wonder if you could just reflect for a few moments on the role of economists and their relationship with their own governments and systems, and if the story could be cast just in an alternative version of this as battles within each bloc itself. And again, I'm an historian whose last class in economics was 1976.
Well, thanks, Eric. 1976 economics probably equips you quite well to look back on some of those sort of arguments. Were the battles within blocks? You get someone, yes, absolutely, there were. I guess my selection is very heterogeneous, so people are in different positions. You have Ludwig Erhard, who's sort of curiously unsensitive to economics going on out there, and he just does things. So he's decided pretty early on that the way to revive the German economy, this is very early on after the war, is simply to remove restrictions, plus putting in place some safety net. And he just does that. In fact, during the American occupation time, the Americans call him in and say, there's a rumor that you, at this stage, he was a director of economic policy, there's a rumor that you have been talking about removing rationing and other price regulations. And he said, it's not a rumor. Yesterday I announced that. And he seems to be sort of blissfully unaware and unconcerned about the internal politics of the whole thing. The British and the French disapproved of that. The Americans disapproved of it until they decided that was a pretty strong answer to what was happening on the Eastern Bloc. And they could see that this is West Germany, were responding well to it. So they approved of it eventually. So you've got people like Ludwig Erhard, who somehow connects with the German people. He's very popular. He speaks well. He's got a reasonably straightforward economic recipe for how Germany should go. His chancellor, Adenauer, can't stand him on a whole bunch of levels. And Adenauer is trying to weave this careful path with the French and other Europeans to get Germany back on a peace path. And he just sees Erhard as sort of trampling through some of that. You've got others like Harry Dexter White, who I suspect is sort of struggling. He's got his sympathising colleagues. He's got one relationship with them. He's got the ear of the Secretary of Treasury, but it looks like US State Department can't stand him and try and stop him in various cases from doing various things. But I suspect he's also sort of struggling with what's going on in his brain. And personally, I think with him, he feels that he has a unique view of the US economy after the war and the juxtaposition of other leading guys after the war. And he thinks it's his personal role to propagate that. And that's why he's leaking information on certain things to the Soviets. He trusts his own judgment in that. And then certainly others. So Joan Robinson was pretty much a sort of a rebel within her own colleagues, and that's how she lived her life as something of a radical, and that's what Samuelson or Solo in the statement that Brad just brought up is protesting about. Ariane, you were going to say something.
Yes, just jumping on the discussion and the question of Eric about the battle within each bloc. For the chapter on Ludwig Erhard, and I was surprised that you didn't mention the new management of the economy state in Germany, but also UK, France, due to social security, but the fact that the government has to run the country and especially the social security, but not only, with the trade unions and also the capitalists, all the tycoons and so on. And they had to fight with new trade unions who were here to manage, who had their own political view on what should be the economy. And in Germany, Erhard succeeded in put the communist apart in the trade union. And he had the Christian approach or the social democrat approach within the trade union. And he trained them as more planned social economy, as you mentioned, the social market. In France, it was completely the opposite, because you had different kind of approach. And it's not only a political approach of the trade union, it's also a design, a definition, a specific theoretical framework. And in France, you have the communists with the CGT against the Christian and so on. And in the UK, it's another. So, and for this manager, for this economics, they had this battle against new people to speak to. But maybe Catherine, who is a political scientist, knows better about this new people going into the dialogue, the dialogue between the authorities. It was a battle within the bloc in Europe. Okay, not in the States.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Yes, that is important. And while I do talk about social security in Germany and the trade unions and the business and the tripartite arrangements, I don't spend much time on that. And that is a very important part of the German story, and to some extent the Erhard story. Erhard joined the Mont Pelerin Society later on, and he's sort of been labelled by some as a libertarian, but I don't think that's true at all. He did have a view about unregulated markets, but he also was doing that nested into this very important set of social institutions. And they're part of the sort of middle way tripartite arrangement. Actually, I think they're quite hard to fit into this story, because they are a different but important part of it. And thanks, I do take that on board. Some of the other issues about economists within their own environment. In Japan, after a terrible war effort and an increasing realization by the Japanese population about what they had done to other countries and people, you find quite a groundswell of moral support for new economists who are part of the new Japan story about an open Japan, a growing economic Japan, and getting away from the militarist-controlled technocrats of past. And they're actually buoyed along, in a way, by a popular view about we need a new way forward, and perhaps they can help us get there. So, yes, there are. This is really going back to Eric's point on economists and their own, amongst their colleagues, but amongst also in their populations.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think you're raising a really good point about when the economists enter the debate and how the younger ideas can rise and interact within the blocks. And I also think that there's a tension, and this wasn't the purpose of your book at all, but there's a tension between those whose careers were primarily in the universities and those whose careers were far more focused, like Harry Dexter White, it seems to me, on his public service. And so I know it's far afield what you were looking into when it came to the book, but when I was going through my own mind and trying to think of, well, what would be a quote unquote a true American? Well, a true American is an immigrant. So I can't say that because someone either came to the United States or they're first generation immigrant, but I was trying to think of what would have brought a new dimension to this, and how would it have entered? Would it have come through the university system more readily, or through the political system in, as you pointed out, India? I really like the comparison you made between what Prevish was looking at in Latin America and what was going on in the Indian post-colonial world. Very different in the 1950s. That very different debate, and another different academic environment in India. And certainly the area I probably studied the most in African universities was dramatically different in the 1950s and the 1960s post-colonial era, the thinking about economic development. So completely divorced from Prevish and Walt Rostow and all the rest. But I don't offer that as a criticism, but just more fuel for thought, because I think that was, it's one book. You can only do so much. I think the third, I understand now that you wrote the book before. Now you have your work cut out for the post-UNCTAD kind of going forward 1970s development debates in the post-colonial world after the decline of the new international economic order.
Actually, I'm going backwards. I'm looking at earlier periods now. But you did make a point about US, that all the Americans in this book go in and out of universities and public life. And there is something about the US system where you do get a lot more mobility between people going in and out of academia. And of course, in this period, US universities are very well funded. Of course, a lot of students, many of them GIs, coming in, and if you're anything to do with the military, industrial, and espionage complex, then you're very well funded. And of course, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton keep coming up time after time in terms of the players in these sort of hard-end Cold War debates. So there is a university story behind all of that.
Thank you. I am unfortunately obliged to call this session to a close. There's a lot more that we could have talked about. To those in the audience, let me just say there's a lot more in this book. And in addition to the story of economic thought and its relationship to practice and policies, and of course, the Cold War, the biographical accounts themselves are absolutely fascinating. And you render the story that you tell very readable through the lives, the dilemmas, the debates of the people that you focus on. So it's also a good read. I want to extend my thanks to Alan, Ariane, Catherine, and Brad, and those of you in our audience. And remember, our next session is not this coming Monday, but rather a week from Thursday on October 12th at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll return to discuss Columbia University journalism professor Samuel Friedman's new book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights, with discussants Elizabeth Tandy Shermer and Jane Daly. Till then, take care. Good night.